Hi, everyone. So over the course of this class, as well as EVP 1, we've tried to provide you with detailed explanation as to why practitioners and researchers should consider appraising systematic reviews and using systematic reviews to inform their practice. And that's totally appropriate. It's all good and well. But as we progress into this semester and ask you guys as part of your final project to complete your own systematic reviews in your groups, and we'll talk about groups next week, the question becomes, well, how do I actually complete a systematic review? If you know what one is in theory and you have a strong understanding of the value of the systematic reviews, that's kind of step one. And what we're going to talk about in this slide deck here, as well as the following video, is going to be how do you put these skills, how do you take a systematic review in theory and actually put one together? What tricks of the trade can you apply? What tools can you use to make your review as organized as possible? And what other resources are available to make sure that you're not duplicating any efforts and you're really making sure that you're doing a thorough, rigorous job in terms of appraising the articles that might be included in your systematic review. And so what we're going to talk about right now is just two main tools that you can use and that we will ask you to use as part of your final project to complete your own systematic reviews. So let me go ahead and switch on over into presenter mode here. So I really love this graphic. And the reason I love this graphic is because on the left-hand side, that blue circle, we've been talking a lot about evidence-based practice. That is the name of this course, in fact. And we've mentioned that in order for us to deliver evidence-based practice in the real-world setting, we need to have a strong balance between our own clinical expertise, the best available research evidence, and of course, what is important and meaningful to our patients or to our clients. But given the nature of this course, we tend to focus more on research and how to find research, appraise it, and decide if it is worthy of being implemented into practice. And so when we look, though, on the right-hand side of this figure, of this diagram, as you guys have practiced developing, you start out with your clinical question. Sometimes we might refer to that, of course, as a PICO question. And so you start with that clinical question. And to answer that question, you try to identify relevant studies that could help you think about your question in terms of answering that question. And then we move into making recommendations based on those studies that pertain to your clinical questions. So as you develop clinical questions for this final project, you might begin to think to yourself, well, how do I actually identify relevant studies to answer the PICO question that I'm going to develop with my group mates? And so to help you begin to think about how this will actually shake out in real life, first, it's always a good idea to have a plan in place for what you're going to try to do when completing your systematic review. Now, of course, the perhaps most obvious place to start is going to be starting with your topic of interest, selecting a topic in the health and rehab field, regardless of if you're a respiratory therapist, an OT student, a PT student, you're going to find a common shared interest with your group mates, and based on that interest, develop your PICO question. It's always nice to have a strong background as to why that question is important and provide some rationale, because otherwise, if you don't have that rationale, then it just seems like you're pulling your question out of thin air. So the background and the rationale for that question is important. Then you'll develop your systematic search, which we'll talk about. You'll figure out how you're going to actually select articles that you come across, how you're going to decide which ones should be included in your final review and which ones should get kicked to the curb, so to speak. You will have the option of using any appraisal tool that you would like to appraise the studies that you ultimately find. And you could use, for instance, we got very familiar with some of the tools that were made available on the Cincinnati Children's website from last semester. This semester, we've been using tools that have been made available through the Johanna Briggs Institute. But again, the choice is yours. I feel like perhaps for the sake of everyone's comfort, it might be easier to select an appraisal tool that we're all familiar with. But again, we'll leave that decision up to you and your group mates. And then lastly, of course, you go through all this work trying to identify studies, read them, appraise them. The ultimate goal is to then make recommendations based on what this grouping of studies says about a certain intervention or interventions that we want to implement into practice in order to achieve a certain patient outcome. We've throughout the course of the past 2 semesters now, we've talked about each of these different areas and different levels of detail. Last semester, you got fairly comfortable developing a PICO question. We'll revisit the PICO question and how to develop one again this semester. We're going to focus these slides at least, and then the subsequent lecture after this, on how to conduct a systematic search, and then how to actually select articles to be included in your systematic review. And that is, of course, based off the application of inclusion and exclusion criteria, all of which you want to establish on the front end before you embark upon your systematic review, so that you can, in a cohesive and organized manner, make sure that you and your group mates are applying the same inclusion and exclusion criteria to all the studies that you come across in your systematic search. So let's start with that systematic search. What does that actually look like? So there are several parts to a systematic search. I'm just going to highlight 3 right now. And I know we talked about this last semester, but there are the databases that you can search. And the databases basically are this storage of different academic journals, peer-reviewed journals, as well as other sources of information, dissertations, government reports sometimes. They house different studies that might be relevant to your PICO question. So you got your databases such as PubMed. The demonstration that I'll provide in the next video will be looking at databases such as CINAHL, Medline, and one that is specific to older adult research. Once you've narrowed down your databases, you've selected databases that are relevant to your PICO question, the population that you're interested in, then you're going to think about what terms you actually want to use in your search strategy. What string of terms are you going to put together? The example below, I'm interested in fall prevention, so that's one term. I'm interested in fall prevention specific in the older adult population. That is where we know we see falls most often. And then if we're going to narrow it down even further, I'm interested in interventions that are delivered in the home setting, so the home-based interventions, as opposed to interventions that might be delivered in a clinic or community-based setting. And then jumping back up to the top of this slide again, if we think about the time frame, it's also important to consider when conducting our systematic search. The majority of the time, we want to find recent research and the most cutting-edge, up-to-date findings from empirical research studies. And so for the example that I'm going to show you all, I've narrowed my time frame down to just the past 5 years for the sake of demonstration, but several of you might have to widen that out to about 10 years. Or maybe even longer in order to find a sufficient body of literature to answer your PICO question. I'm also just making a note here, it can be helpful, although one of the tools that I'll show you helps kind of track your search process for you, but it can be helpful, especially for those of you that are more the kinesthetic learner type that enjoy writing things down or typing things out. It can be helpful to track how many studies each of your search strategies yield. So for instance, I conducted a search back on February 5th, combining these different search terms that are in parentheses, and that search strategy, that string of search terms yielded for me 48 studies that I would potentially then go through and decide, yes, no, this study is relevant to my PICO question. But again, we'll go into more detail when I show you a demonstration. The article selection process. So when you're making that decision, yes, no, is this article in or out? Am I going to allow this article to actually make it into my final pick of articles that are reflective of answering my PICO question? In order to get to that final pool of articles that are reflective of your PICO question, you apply your inclusion and exclusion criteria. Inclusion obviously meaning, yes, this study does pertain to my PICO question, so we're going to keep it in. Exclusion is the opposite. This study does not pertain to my population of interest. It's a different age range of individuals. The outcomes of interest are totally off base, so I'm going to kick it out. I don't want it to be part of my final pool of studies. And so I know I just rattled off a couple of those inclusion and exclusion criteria that pertain to the population, age range, and outcomes for your final project. To keep things as clean and consistent as possible, you're going to want to include only studies that examine actual interventions or programs. And that could be a randomized control trial, it could be a quasi-experimental trial, it could be just a simple, an example of a quasi-experimental, it could be a simple pre-post test. Maybe there's a control group, maybe there's not. We want to see if an intervention has an impact on an outcome at 2 different time points. So pre-test and then ideally post-test. Other kind of inclusion exclusion to think about is there an application to clinical practice? Maybe you're entering search terms in your search strategy into different databases, and you come across a slew of articles that pertain to maybe basic science, looking at changes in molecular structures. And that in and of itself is certainly interesting and has a role in the grand scheme of translational science, but is less applicable to clinical practice. And so you might want to, as you think about setting up your inclusion exclusion criteria and putting actual criteria on paper, you might want to think about how you're going to decide with your group mates whether or not an article is going to be relevant to the clinical practice setting. And then there are other tiny details along the lines of format. Sometimes as you're searching databases, you'll come across poster presentations or abstracts from conferences that where the authors shared their findings via just a poster presentation. And you might want to exclude those simply because that abstract only provides very little information. It's interesting information, I'm sure, but that format of that poster presentation abstract is not what we're looking for necessarily with this final group project. And then lastly, you and your group mates can talk about this, but you'll likely want to exclude, and every group is different, so take this with a grain of salt. There are exceptions to the rule, but you'll likely want to exclude other reviews. You're doing your own systematic review, and so it can muddy the waters if you include other systematic reviews or scoping reviews or narrative reviews in your own review. Again, we can deal with this on a case-by-case basis if it proves to be a problem, but oftentimes you'll see that reviews may not be included in other systematic reviews themselves. You might also want to exclude conceptual papers. Those are position papers, you'll hear them referred to as. Those are papers that get published all the time, where maybe an author or a group of authors are pitching a new innovative idea, kind of getting the ball rolling on using a certain technology in practice, for instance. And then lastly, I won't be surprised if some of you, when you do your search, you come across dissertations, graduate theses, graduate papers that, again, might yield some interesting findings, but you'll have to decide with you and your group mates if you want to include that dissertation, which will likely be a long read, if you want to include that dissertation in your actual final pool of articles that you keep in your final review. All right, so let's say that you've sat down with your group mates. You've talked about things like the databases that you're going to search, the terms that you're going to put together and enter into your different databases. You've talked about the date range that you want to narrow your search down to. You've also sat down with your group mates and you've talked about, okay, well, what articles are we going to include and what articles are we going to exclude? And don't get me wrong, it's a tall order and it's somewhat of an iterative process. Because when you're new to this and when you're new to searching for relevant articles to answer a PICO question, you don't know what to include and you don't know what to exclude. So when I say it's an iterative process, it really is, especially in the stage where the majority of you are. It's fine to have maybe an initial idea as to what articles you want to include and which ones you're going to exclude based on different criteria, but that is certainly not a list of criteria that should be set in stone, at least at this point in your respective careers. But it is good to at least have a starting point and to be in agreement on the front end as to what general pool of articles you are trying to identify. And so then the big question becomes, well, what's next? We've written down all these pieces of information. We have a good plan as to how we're going to go forward and try to find relevant studies that pertain to our PICO question. Well, what do we do next? My answer to you is straightforward in some regard, in the sense that if you've not already done this, and I was late to the game, I will be transparent, I was very late to the game and did not start using a citation manager or reference manager until much later in my career. I'm very happy that I'm doing so now, but if those of you out there also feel like you're late to the game, I feel like this course is a nice opportunity to familiarize yourself with a citation reference manager. I tend to prefer Zotero, and that is the demonstration I'll show in the next video, but there are several other citation managers out there that will be helpful as you try to organize types of studies that you want to include as part of your review. So in terms of the what's next steps, step one, select and download a citation reference manager if you don't already have one. And then step two is going to be to establish a Covidence account through the prior health sciences library. Ohio State pays for a university-wide subscription to Covidence, which is a web-based platform for conducting systematic and scoping reviews. And so you can hopefully copy and paste that link into your browser. If it does not seem to work for you, which I know in the past some students have had a little bit of trouble with the copy and paste of this link, so you can instead just do a quick Google search for Ohio State Health Sciences Library Covidence, and that should take you to a link, and then you just click the Covidence sign up page. And so you want to make sure that you're signing up for a Covidence account through Ohio State's link, because that will get you free access to Covidence's features. It's a great program, and I will show you how to use it. And you'll go ahead and check out the Covidence and Zotero video in order for you to see just how to familiarize yourself with a citation manager like Zotero, and then how you can use Zotero in combination with Covidence to organize the studies that you potentially want to include in your review, and how to narrow down from a large pool of studies a much smaller pool that meet your inclusion and exclusion criteria. That's all.